Hello, Esme. I brought you a new book. It's called Polly Pecorino, the Girl Who Rescues Animals. I thought it was quite a short book. Turns out there's 200 plus pages for me to read to you. That's good news if you like the book, and bad news if you don't. I'll read a few chapters and we'll see how we get along. Polly Pecorino, Chapter 1. Some people can pass a fly drowning in a puddle or a beetle battling for its life on the surface of a swimming pool, and some can't. The ones that can't are rescuers. If you've ever stopped to save a fly or a beetle or some other struggling creature, then you are probably a rescuer too. Polly Pecorino was a constant rescuer. From the moment she took her first tottering steps, she was knee-deep in puddles, saving lives. The first creature she ever saved was a daddy longlegs. She fished it out of her mother's banana frappe. You would never have guessed from looking at her that there was anything unusual about Polly. She looked like an ordinary schoolgirl with brown hair and brown eyes. She liked doing all the usual things that schoolgirls do, and didn't like doing plenty of the other usual things too, particularly homework. But there was something unusual about Polly. As well as rescuing animals, she could actually talk to them, including birds, insects, and even amphibians, especially frogs. It was like being able to speak in another language without having to learn it. It made her feel better about not being very good at French. Polly couldn't explain how she did it, and she didn't try to because most people wouldn't have believed her, and the rest might have thought she was showing off. That meant hardly anybody knew about her gift, only her parents and her Uncle Stan, even though she used it all the time. Sometimes she'd be in the middle of breakfast with her parents, and she might hear the tiniest cry or the shrillest shriek of a creature in pain. Then she'd jump up without warning and rush out to the garden, returning later, having saved a life. It could have been a fledgling that had toppled out of its nest, or perhaps a tiny shrew trapped in a flower pot. If the creature was injured, Polly did her best to nurse it back to health. This was how Polly had first met Crow. One early morning, when she'd been in the middle of a dream about ring-tailed lemurs, she'd been woken by piercing cries. She'd thrown on her clothes and run straight out into the pouring rain. She'd found the crow half a mile away in the park. He had fallen from an old chestnut tree and was scrambling around in a muddy puddle, trying to stand, falling, trying again, falling, all while flapping his scrappy wings. He was panicking. He couldn't get out of the puddle. Polly looked for his parents or any sign of his nest, but couldn't see either. She reckoned he was a long way from home, so she scooped him up, wrapped him in her cardigan, and took him with her. He didn't struggle or make a fuss. Back at her house, when she examined him, she found he had broken a leg and was suffering from shock. So, after making a little splint, which she taped to his leg with elastoplasts, she carried him about with her for the rest of the day, warm against her chest. He'd been so frightened by what had happened to him that it wasn't until later that he'd eventually spoken to her, and Polly gathered that he'd been flying alone for the first time. He'd wanted to try out his wings and explore to soar above the trees the way he'd seen the other crows do. His parents had told him to wait because he wasn't ready, but he just couldn't wait any longer. And flying had been such a wonderful feeling, he told her, except he hadn't expected the wind to be so fierce. It was fighting me, it was twisting all of my feathers, he said, and that's when I fell and landed in the puddle. Polly kept the crow with all her through the following fortnight, taking him wherever she went, apart from school. When he stayed in her bedroom, it wasn't ideal, as Polly's mother often said, because his leg mended and the crow became more energetic and daring, and especially inquisitive. Polly never knew what to expect when she came home. More than once, she found the contents of her drawers and cupboards scattered all over the floor. At the end of the 2 weeks, Polly took Crow to see her Uncle Stan, who was an expert in animals. First, Stan checked his leg, which he said was healing nicely, and then he gently stretched out one of Crow's wings to have a look. Well, he said, they probably do need a little bit more time to grow before he flies. He smoothed out the longest feathers. They'll soon be strong enough. He's lucky he has you to look after him. Polly had known that when Crow's leg was better and his wings were bigger, she would have had to let him go. He was a wild creature, and he would need to live in the wild world where he came from. When the time came to release him, they went to the top of a nearby hill so that he could see all around and choose a direction to fly in. Polly prepared herself to say goodbye, and Crow eventually swooped away unsteadily towards the trees. Moments later, he swooped back and landed on her head. Aren't you going? Polly had asked. I prefer to stay, if I may, he replied. And so he stayed. That's the end of chapter 1 of Polly Pecorino. I hope you enjoyed. Many more chapters to come.